Part 1. The Ghost in the Spotlight. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a movie theater just before the final credits roll. Not the silence of emptiness. The silence of something felt too deeply for immediate words. Audiences have sat inside that silence thousands of times, in theaters from Tokyo to Toronto, from Buenos Aires to Berlin. And more often than they might consciously realize, the face responsible for that silence belonged to Nicolas Cage. Not because he was the most conventionally handsome actor of his generation, not because studios always handed him the safest material, but because something in his performances refused to be ignored, something raw, unfiltered, dangerously alive, that would leap from the screen and grab the viewer before they had time to protect themselves from it. He was, by every measurable standard, a star, an Academy Award winner, a box office phenomenon, a name that guaranteed attention across multiple decades of an industry that routinely discards its most celebrated figures the moment a younger version arrives. And yet, the real story of Nicolas Cage was never simply about fame. It was about the cost of being completely, recklessly, magnificently yourself in an industry that preferred predictability. A man who built castles and watched them burn, who stood at the summit and stepped off the edge, and who somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found a way to climb back through the wreckage of his own legend. But that is not where the story begins. Part 2. Born into the shadow Long Beach, California. January 7th, 1964. A child is born into a household where cinema is not entertainment, it is oxygen. His father, August Coppola, is a literature professor. His mother, Joy Vogelsang, a dancer whose artistic sensitivity would quietly shape the boy's inner world. And his uncle, formidable, magnificent, is Francis Ford Coppola, the man who gave the world The Godfather, the man whose name in Hollywood carried the weight of a dynasty. Nicholas Kim Coppola grew up understanding, without anyone needing to explain it, that he carried a surname that opened doors. What no one anticipated was how desperately he would want to open those doors himself, on his own terms. Even as a child, there was something different about him, an intensity in his gaze, an internal life too large for ordinary spaces. He discovered acting through school productions and recognized it immediately as the one place where being too much was, for the first time, precisely enough. But as young ambition deepened, he confronted a reality no amount of talent could dissolve. His last name was both a crown and a cage. Every audition room he entered already had opinions about the Coppola family. Every director he approached was thinking the question no one asked aloud: is this talent or is this bloodline? He needed to answer that definitively, for the industry, for the world, and most urgently for himself. So he changed his name. Nicolas Coppola became Nicolas Cage, borrowed partly from Marvel Comics character Luke Cage, partly from avant-garde composer John Cage. Both figures who had built identities entirely through art, not inheritance. The name change was not a rejection of family. It was a declaration of self. It was Nicolas Cage telling the world, judge this on its own merits. Part 3. The unconventional arrival. Hollywood in the early 1980s valued beauty, charm, and the kind of charisma that could be easily packaged. Nicolas Cage did not get that memo. His early roles were deliberate experiments. Rumblefish in 1983, directed, inevitably, by Francis Ford Coppola, taught him something important. Working within the family orbit was something he would need to step beyond. Birdie in 1984 paired him with Matthew Modine in a psychologically complex story about veterans processing trauma. The performance was startling in its willingness to go to uncomfortable places. Critics took notice, and then came Raising Arizona, 1987, directed by Joel and Ethan Coen. Nicolas Cage played H.I. McDonough, an ex-convict whose love for his wife and a stolen baby propelled the film through physical comedy and genuine emotional tenderness simultaneously. What Cage did was something most actors never attempt. He committed to a character who could have been a cartoon and found the human being inside the absurdity. The film became a cult phenomenon that has only grown richer with time. Somewhere in that process, Nicolas Cage understood something about his own artistic identity that would define everything that followed. He was not interested in playing it safe. His instincts always pulled him toward the edge, toward the performance that made directors nervous, toward the character choice others would have abandoned at the table read stage, but that was not yet the whole story. Part 4. Moonstruck in the Making of a Star. Moonstruck 1987, a romantic comedy set in Brooklyn's Italian-American community. Nicolas Cage played Ronnie Camerieri, a one-handed, emotionally volatile man who falls desperately in love with his brother's fiancée, played by Cher, with a passion so unrestrained, so operatically committed, that it transformed a supporting role into one of the most memorable romantic performances of the decade. The scene in which Ronnie drags Loretta to the Metropolitan Opera, declaring with terrifying sincerity that we are here to ruin ourselves and love the wrong people, became one of those cinematic moments that enters the culture and refuses to leave. Moonstruck won Best Picture, Cher won Best Actress, and Nicolas Cage became someone the entire industry understood was not merely interesting, he was essential. What audiences saw was confidence. What he carried was something more complicated. Part 5. Leaving Las Vegas and the Weight of Truth. There are performances that entertain, performances that impress, and then there are performances that haunt, that follow the audience home, that surface unexpectedly in quiet moments weeks after watching. Leaving Las Vegas, 1995, directed by Mike Figgis. Nicolas Cage played Ben Sanderson, a Hollywood screenwriter who has lost everything and arrived in Las Vegas with the explicit intention of drinking himself to death. Cage prepared through total immersion, filming himself drinking, recording audio journals in character, spending time with people navigating addiction, not to take notes, but to absorb the specific texture of that reality into his own emotional memory. What emerged was devastating in the way only truth is devastating. Ben Sanderson was not a tragic figure at a safe narrative distance. He was alive, present, uncomfortable, and heartbreaking in the way that actual human collapse is heartbreaking, without redemption arc, without the cushioning of genre convention. The Academy awarded Nicolas Cage the Oscar for Best Actor. He stood at the podium in March 1996, and the award felt simultaneously deserved and somehow not quite adequate to what he had actually done. Because what Cage had accomplished was not a performance in the conventional sense. It was a surrender, a complete, controlled, courageous surrender to the darkest corners of human experience, executed with such precise artistry that the technique became invisible beneath the truth, and that was where the distance began. Part 6. The blockbuster years and the paradox. The Oscar transaction in Hollywood is simple. You win, and in exchange, the industry upgrades your asking price and places you in conversations previously conducted in your absence. Nicolas Cage used that transaction in a way that surprised some observers. He said yes to The Rock in 1996, Con Air in 1997, Face/Off in 1997 alongside John Travolta. 3 action blockbusters in rapid succession. The critical establishment was puzzled, but audiences had no such confusion. They showed up in enormous numbers. The Rock earned over $330 million worldwide, Con Air over $224 million, Face/Off over $245 million. Nicolas Cage had not abandoned cinema for commerce. He had proven something more interesting, that the same performer who could deliver the most psychologically devastating dramatic work of his generation could carry a summer blockbuster with the confidence of someone who had never doubted he belonged exactly where he was. Behind the success, however, something else was building, an intensity that cinema absorbed but could not satisfy, an appetite for experience that no box office number could adequately capture, and then came the consequences. Part 7. The Collection and the Collapse. To understand what happened to Nicolas Cage in the 2000s, it is necessary to understand how creative obsession can express itself beyond the work itself. He began acquiring, not casually and not strategically in any financial sense, but with the same total commitment he brought to every character. 2 castles in Europe, a private island in the Bahamas, rare comics including Action Comics #1, one of the most valuable in existence, a Lamborghini once owned by the Shah of Iran, shrunken heads, dinosaur skulls. The press filed the acquisitions under celebrity eccentricity without pausing to consider what they actually represented. A man trying to build, in the physical world, the mythological reality his imagination permanently inhabited. The problem arrived slowly, then all at once. Nicolas Cage was earning at an extraordinary rate, but spending at a rate that exceeded even that. The financial crisis of 2008 deepened the damage. Properties revealed themselves as liabilities. The IRS filed liens. The castle in England went to auction. The island in the Bahamas was foreclosed. His business manager faced legal action. The world watched with the particular mixture of sympathy and satisfaction that public financial collapse tends to generate, recognition that the rules which govern everyone else apply after all to those who seemed exempt from them. But this was not the end of Nicolas Cage's story. It was the beginning of its most interesting chapter. Part 8. The years of working between 2010 and 2020, Nicolas Cage made a very large number of films. Critics noted the volume with bemusement. The narrative that formed was comprehensible in its simplicity, a fallen star completing a cautionary tale, accepting whatever project would have him. That narrative was not entirely wrong. The financial pressures were real, but it missed something essential. Within that volume of work, there were performances of genuine, startling quality that almost no one noticed at the time. Joe in 2013, directed by David Gordon Green, a brutal, tender film in which Cage delivered quiet, devastating power that reminded everyone who saw it that the technique had never left, only the audiences had stopped looking. Mandy in 2018, directed by Panos Cosmatos, a psychedelic revenge nightmare in which Cage's grief transformed into something elemental and mythological, operating far beyond the conventions of genre cinema. These were not the performances of a man who had given up. These were the performances of a man still relentlessly searching for truth inside every character, still operating from the same fearless artistic commitment that had produced Leaving Las Vegas, even when the surrounding productions were significantly more modest. The applause was real, so were the consequences, but the work was never less than honest. Part 9. Pig and the Return. 2021, a small film, a quiet film, Pig, directed by Michael Sarnowski. Nicolas Cage plays Robin Feld, a truffle forager living alone in the Oregon wilderness whose prize pig is stolen, pulling him back into the world he had long abandoned. The film is not quite a revenge thriller, not quite a drama. It is at its core a meditation on grief, identity, and what remains of a person when everything the world knew them for has been stripped away. Cage's performance is unlike anything he had done before, almost preternaturally still. The volcanic intensity of his most famous work refined, compressed, made dense and heavy rather than explosive. The grief in his eyes required no external expression. It simply was, the way real grief is. Critics who had spent years filing Cage under interesting but excessive were confronted with a performance that demanded complete revision of their assumptions. Not because Cage had changed, but because Pig provided the precise conditions in which the depth of what had always been there could finally be clearly seen. The word masterpiece appeared in multiple reviews, and the cultural conversation around Nicolas Cage shifted, from cautionary tale back to something more accurate, artist, enduring, complex, unclassifiable, irreducible artist. What happened next would redefine everything. Part 10. The Unbearable Weight and the Final Joke, 2022. The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, directed by Tom Gormican. Nicolas Cage plays a fictionalized version of himself, financially desperate, artistically frustrated, entangled with a billionaire superfan played by Pedro Pascal. The film could have been vanity. Instead, it was something far more courageous, a genuine act of self-examination, wrapped in genre entertainment, in which the autobiographical currents ran far deeper than the comedy on the surface. To play a version of yourself, not idealized, not heroic, but struggling and slightly ridiculous and still somehow magnificent, requires a kind of honesty that most performers never develop and fewer still display publicly. Nicolas Cage displayed it with total ease. The film performed well commercially. It was received warmly by critics who recognized in the willingness to self-parody something more honest than self-promotion. And it completed a transformation Pig had begun. The re-establishment of Nicolas Cage not as a comeback story, but as a permanent fixture of American cinema, one whose relationship with the audience was too complex, too layered with decades of mutual experience to be reduced to simple narrative. Part 11. What Remains. Late afternoon light on a Los Angeles street, the kind of golden, softened light that Hollywood cinematographers spend careers trying to recreate artificially because the natural version appears only briefly and disappears before you can memorize it. Nicolas Cage is 60 years old. He has been making films for over 40 years. He has an Academy Award. He has children he loves and a life quieter now than during the years when tabloids found his daily existence professionally relevant. He has a filmography that, taken in its entirety, is one of the most genuinely strange and genuinely rewarding bodies of work American cinema has produced since the New Hollywood era, not despite its inconsistencies and range and willingness to occupy spaces other careers avoid, but because of all those things. The directors who have worked with him, the Coen brothers, Mike Figgis, Werner Herzog, David Gordon Green, Spike Jonze, Ridley Scott, Brian De Palma, form a list that reads less like a commercial actor's roster and more like the collaborations a genuinely significant artist accumulates over a life devoted to what cinema can do. Nicolas Cage represents the particular cost of radical authenticity. In an industry built on image management, on the careful construction of public persona, he persistently, almost constitutionally, refused to manage. He felt things too visibly, spent too conspicuously, chose projects too idiosyncratically, inhabited his characters too completely for the machine to ever entirely process him. The industry rewarded him enormously for this, and then penalized him. The years of dismissal were real. The meme culture that reduced decades of extraordinary work to reaction images was real. But the work survived, Raising Arizona survived, Moonstruck survived. Leaving Las Vegas and Mandy and Pig and the unbearable weight of massive talent all survived, not as historical records but as living films that continue to affect the people who discover them, that make directors and actors recalibrate their own ambitions. What people called eccentricity often came from something simpler and rarer, a relentless refusal to be dishonest on screen. And when the lights go down in theaters around the world and the credits roll on whatever comes next, because there will always be something that comes next, as long as Nicolas Cage is alive and cameras are rolling, that silence will be there again. Waiting, the way it always has been, the way somehow it always will be.